Okay, so what we're going to be covering today on the Finance Addendum 22A is paragraph 5 for earnest money. Pretty basic. If buyer has not waived the financing contingency and is unable to obtain financing by closing after a good faith effort, then on the buyer's notice, this agreement shall terminate. And that notice is going to be the 90I, which is buyer's notice of termination of financing that's unavailable. Pretty basic. Buyer's notice of termination, it hereby gives notice that in good faith effort, the buyer is unable to obtain financing, and the buyer hereby elects to terminate the agreement and demands the return of the earnest money. So pretty basic there. So with this, you would like, or you would want your, the lender to actually go in and do a letter that is of the things here in paragraph 5. So to get that, the lender must confirm in writing the date the buyer's loan application for the property was made, including a copy of the loan estimate that was provided to the buyer, that the buyer possessed sufficient funds to close, such as the down payment and closing costs, and the reason that the buyer was unable to obtain financing by the closing. And if the seller terminates this agreement, then the earnest money shall be refunded without need for such a confirmation. Those are pretty basic. So as long as they have that, then with the Form 50 to get their earnest money back, they shouldn't have any problems. One other thing that correlates with this finance addendum as well is the 22AC. Of course, this is if they need to change lenders or change the type of the loan. Due to maybe they can't get financing from their original lender or the original type that was put into the purchase and sale agreement. So they would want to fill this out. And this is really basic. They would just want to check one of the boxes or even both if they're changing lenders and changing loan types. But the first box there, just basically they're going to put in what their old loan was, so the one that they're changing from, and then they're going to put in the new type of loan that they're going to. And then, of course, in the next box down, the seller's consent to change lender, it's going to be the old lender and put in the new lender. And then if they need to change the amount of days for them to make application, they can, but the default is 3 days. Pretty basic. And then they'll sign this and send it over for the seller to initiate or to initial and then send back for that. Doug, do you have any input?
Well, yeah, so that's an important one, to make sure your buyer knows after that first 5 days pass when they're going to make their initial loan application, you know, make sure that the buyer knows that if they're going to change loan type or lender, that they have to get prior seller permission. And that's key, because a lot of times what can happen if your buyers don't know that, even though they sign the, you know, financing addendum, they forget the stuff that's on there, and they might call you and go, hey, guess what? I just switched lenders, or my lender decided to switch loan types, and they already have done it. Well, if you do that, they could, through those actions, waive their financing contingency. And so just, you know, when you do that initial financing contingency with them, make sure that they know that if they're going to make any changes, to let you know, so you can help with the paperwork to get prior seller permission to change loan type or lender.
And obviously in the purchase and sale and that finance contingency, if they mark like conventional and let's say FHA, if they were originally going conventional, they have the backup of that already being pre-checked, so they wouldn't need this form.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can check more than one box. Now, you know, Annie Fitzsimmons says, you know, don't check all the boxes in terms of the loan type your buyer's going to get. But if they're going back and forth between conventional and maybe FHA, and they're not totally sure, you could check both of those boxes. And that way, if they're getting one of those two loans, you wouldn't have to go, you know, potentially have to get prior seller permission, because you're getting one of the two loan types. But again, you don't check all of them, but what would they reasonably be looking at getting, and that could avoid needing that form, you know, later on.
I feel like I've covered like every single one of these forms in like the last 4 days. It's been crazy.
You have,
So
Toby. I've seen them.
I know I've had a buyer fall out because of their financing, but I also had that other deal where the buyers of my listing, they had issues and they were trying to scramble. And I've seen like every single one of these forms. I felt like maybe I navigated my way through it okay, but there's a lot of weird things that came up. Like I noticed like on that 90I or whatever, like I was like, that's weird. There's no language about the lender letter needing to be attached because normally it's on there that way. But then I noticed as you were doing this review, Mindy, that it's outlined in that first paragraph on the original purchase and sale. I was like, oh, there's the language. But I thought it was weird it wasn't on the notice form. So
yeah, and the finance addendum, unfortunately, in the manual and the actual addendum itself does not state anywhere the 90I. I have combed it, couldn't find it. You know, everybody was like, oh, the 90L. Well, the 90L, that's obviously attached to the 22B. It outlines it in that manual and that paperwork, but had to dig for the 90I. So just be aware that that's if there's no contingency of a home being sold, you can use the 90I.
as I was reading that paragraph too, that might have been covered, like, because what's it say about once the lender has confirmed that they've met the dates and this and that and da 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 da. Do we cover that sometimes when we do the 22AR, or does it also say that they have to say in the letter that it failed?
Well, they want to put it in the letter. So basically what a lot of the brokers are doing is they're just going into paragraph 5 here and they're cut and pasting this so that way the lender knows when they email the lender, you know, requesting a letter from them, and they just say, we need to have all these little things, you know, like what is the date that they made loan out? Did they possess, you know, sufficient funds for down payment, closing costs? And what was the reason that they were unable to obtain financing? So as long as that letter states those things, you can attach that with the 90I and then your Form 50 to get their money back, their earnest money. You should be good to go.
And all of this has to be delivered before the end of the contract period, right? Because I don't know if you saw that where on my listing, they didn't submit any of this stuff prior to it not closing on time. My seller
Toby,
very graciously gave it back to him when I explained, look, the realtor didn't do their job and turn in the paperwork on time, and she didn't want to do that to the buyer. But I had to tell the agent, I'm like, you should have submitted all of this before the closing date, correct?
So actually, Toby, the financing contingency never expires.
Oh, okay.
So it actually outlives the contract date, and so that's why when Annie teaches this form, and we covered this in a previous session, but you know, the seller's notice of intent to terminate, that's the seller's opportunity to get the buyer to waive the financing contingency at some point to share in the risk of the transaction. So whether it's 30 days after mutual acceptance, if you don't change it, or some people try to put 40 days in, whatever it is, because most sellers don't realize this financing contingency never expires. So it's okay if it fails to close and you can provide that letter and from, you know, with all the appropriate things mentioned, the buyer gets their earnest money back. And I think if a lot of sellers realized you could have asked the buyer to waive their financing contingency so that they didn't get their earnest money back at the end of all this, they would be a little frustrated. They would want to know that. And so that's kind of what we said before, is read paragraph actually 2 and 3 to your seller to find out, is this a process you want me to follow on your behalf? Most sellers, if they understand their ability to do the right to terminate, and if they understand being able to ask for the status of the buyer's loan in 22AL, they'll tell you they want you to do that. Now, that's an easier conversation now when you send that to the buyer's agent to say, my seller has asked me to follow the pre-printed language in your buyer's contingency form, and so I'm serving my 22, whichever notice you are, the 22AL, if it's to get loan status updates, or the notice of intent to terminate. So we covered that before, but the reason that's so important is because this contingency never expires.
Yeah, I see the weight there. I was always like 22 AR. I kind of don't understand it, but if this never expires, you almost have to deliver it every time, or you're kind of dumb if you don't, I guess. I don't know.
Well, so there are some cases on the west side where a buyer was trying to get their act together, strung the seller along. Now, after 60 days, finally they send the notice that they can't get financing, and the seller realizes after all of this, they have to give all the earnest money back to the buyer. And so what happened is the listing agent got a letter from the buyer's the agent got a letter from their seller's attorney, rather. So it's your listing. The seller had to give the earnest money back to the buyer, and the attorney said, "Okay, listing agent, can you show that you communicated and made the buyer aware of the right to terminate language, so that the seller could have told you whether he wanted you to do it or not?" Because the point was, you failed to deliver this. It's a pre-printed strategy to protect, at some point in the transaction, protect your seller, and you failed to do it or to make the seller aware of it. And so we'd like you to reimburse your seller for the earnest money. Well, this was like $1 million home, and the earnest money was like $50,000. So the point is let the seller know that that's there for them. And then they'll say, "Yeah, Toby, don't worry about it. I don't care. Let's not do it." Or they'll say, "Yeah, on day 30, I want you to ask the buyer to waive their financing contingency, and let it be the seller choice." I think it's just smart.
It's their choice, but how many times early in the process is the seller feeling great about being under contract and everything's going great, and they're lean more towards, don't worry about it, I'm not super worried about it. But then when things get bad at the end of the transaction, suddenly they're like, I feel like I should be compensated.
Yeah. So Toby, that's a beautiful. So like when your seller's accepting an offer and the buyer's put a financing contingency in there, what a great conversation. Tell them those stories. Say, "I know we're really excited now, but let me tell you what this means. 30 days from now, if we get a feel that this isn't going well, there's one thing that you can do as a seller to protect yourself at that point, to have the buyer bring some skin into the game, have some shared risk, and here's how this works." And so tell the story of, "Hey, often everybody's excited right now, but this is the time to plan for what could happen. And in 30 days, you have the right to do this. And I just want you to know that we can even touch base there. You don't have to do it, but if you instruct me to, I'm going to on your behalf." So anything else, Mindy?
No, I'm good. The one thing I can say is to find this, I did go into the Northwest MLS, and not knowing which addendum it was at first, because it just references buyer's addendum. So if you just query, there's a box that you can search in and just put buyer's notice. This actually pops up with like 5 other different notices that are just buyer's notices. So it's pretty easy to find if you do that, but otherwise it's just the 90I that you'll use.
Yeah, perfect. So I think the takeaway is, sometimes when we're getting things signed up, we just have people, we say, "Here's a financing contingency." Yeah, and they sign it. I think with our clients, buyers and sellers, having them read through a couple of these paragraphs, they certainly don't need to read the entire PSA word for word. But I think this financing contingency is key enough to have them read a couple of these key paragraphs to just know the game plan and what's there to protect the seller. And then there's some things in there, obviously, to protect the buyer. And if everybody knows the game plan going in, it's easier down the road when things start to go sideways.
Mm-hmm.
I'm surprised how often, I know you talked about this earlier, Doug, where if you're working with the lender and they're trying to decide how much they want to put down.
Hi, Mary Rosalie. Hey, I'm in a meeting right now, and I'll call you back just as soon as
How many times, the lender's trying to decide on the down payment if they should go FHA or conventional or what have you, and I've checked both the FHA and the conventional in those times and sent it over, and then I'll get a call from the other side saying, "Hey, which of these are you doing?" And I have to try and explain, no, they're trying to keep both options open. They're working with their lender, and they're going to pick the best one in that 5-day period or whatever to freaking move forward. But I get pushback on that all the time. But we are allowed to check both, correct?
Yes, and that's again per Annie when she teaches this class, and so you absolutely can.
Any other questions from anyone? You can unmute yourself.
I tend to tell people that, can you hear me?
Yes.
I tend to just tell people that when I explain that part, that I like to send the 22AL because it protects them, and or even say that that's my process, that's what I do. Is that inappropriate? I mean, I'm basically saying, you know, this is what I do. I send this on day 10 to protect you. Is it inappropriate to say it that way, do you think? Or, I mean, it does say, you know, seller may there.
No, that's one way you can do it. I kind of like the idea of saying, seller, on your behalf, I have the ability 10 days after mutual acceptance, I have the ability for us to check in with the buyer to see where they are in the status of what they've turned in to their lender. Would you like me to do that on your behalf? And so you can say it's your process, but I think it's really great to get by, you know, the seller. Now, most of the time the seller's going to say, yes, I'd love you to do that on my behalf. So what your process is to let the seller know there's some protections for them. And by the way, this is the buyer's own addendum. The buyer's addendum is inviting the seller to do this. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's about educating the seller and saying, would you like me to do this on your behalf? So your process will be educate the seller. Then what you choose to do is based on what the seller asks you to do. And you could even recommend, hey, I think it's smart. A lot of my sellers really like me to do this. And so would you like me to check in 10 days in to see how the buyer's doing with turning in their stuff to their lender?
Thanks.
Like you said, Doug, so many of these addendums are for the buyer. And so this gives the seller a little bit of power, so to speak, on their behalf.
Yeah, good job. Hey, great job, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to